pro player tip. If you want to make your game master sweat, ask to run the next shopping trip in encounter mode. Today, we're going to talk about the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who remembers that when the players ask to do their shopping trips in encounter mode, that shopkeeper has closer access to all of those cool magical weapons than they do. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series. It's a series where we are working our way through the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We're taking a look at the advice and suggestions that Paizo offers for storytellers in Pathfinder 2e, and attempting to improve our skills as storytellers in this wonderful game. Now, my hope is that this series is something that's going to be beneficial to storytellers of all skill levels, from beginner to veteran, and for storytellers not just of Pathfinder 2e games, but of any different role-playing game out there. One of the things that I have discovered as a storyteller is that when you study a variety of different games, you often learn tips, tricks, and just different ways to look at things when you storytell that can help you improve your skills in your favorite game to run. Today, we're back to Chapter 1 of the Game Mastery Guide, and we're looking at the 3 modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. These modes of play are Encounter Mode, Exploration Mode, and Downtime Mode. And if you're looking to read up on this subject, I suggest checking out pages 10 through 27 of the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and you can also read pages 493 through pages 502 of the core rulebook. There's a lot of useful information in both of these books that can help you understand the purpose of these 3 different modes of play. Now, when Pathfinder 2nd Edition was being playtested, one of the conversations I remember was that there was some pushback when Paizo took the time to really clarify and codify the 3 different modes of play. Encounter mode, exploration mode, and downtime mode are game terms that we've heard for a long time. It's stuff that we've done in role-playing games for quite a while now, but when Paizo announced that they were dividing their game into these 3 different modes of play and offering specific rules for each of these 3 different modes of play, that there was kind of some pushback from the community, and I think a lot of that pushback was geared around a fear that Paizo was making Pathfinder 2nd Edition too mechanical. And I can understand that fear to a degree. It can really break the 4th wall if your storyteller is always saying things like, well, it's time to leave exploration mode and start encounter mode. That is not immersive storytelling. However, since Pathfinder 2e has released, I haven't seen a lot of complaint about these codified modes of play, and I think that a lot of gaming groups have found that these 3 different modes of play flow very naturally between one another and work reasonably well in play. Still, today what we want to do is we want to take a look at these 3 different modes of play. We want to ask what their narrative purpose is in storytelling and take a look at how we can use them to enhance our storytelling when we run Pathfinder 2e games, or if you're running a game other than Pathfinder 2e, how we can take the principles associated with these 3 modes of play and translate them to other games. So, let's get started. Okay, so we've already established the 3 modes of play that Paizo defines for this game are Encounter Mode, which we usually associate with something like combat, Exploration Mode, which could be associated with exploring some abandoned ruins or maybe sailing down a river or something to that effect, and then Downtime Mode, where we allow characters to pursue long-term goals, such as going shopping, crafting weapons, or maybe even running an organization such as a business or a cult. Let's admit it, it's player characters, we know which one they're going for. So I think the key thing to realize when we talk about the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2e is that what we're really talking about is the storytelling element of pacing. One of the trickiest things to learn when you are first setting out to become a storyteller is how to manage the pacing of your story. A story that moves too fast can be difficult to follow, whereas a story that moves too slow might lose the interest of your listeners. And I think we've all encountered that storyteller who just enjoys the sound of their voice way too much and talks way too long and just goes on and on with whatever it is they're trying to relay. I mean, could you imagine a storyteller so long-winded they made the name of their YouTube channel like 7 syllables longer than it needed to be? Pacing is a tricky skill, but it's something that you need to be aware of if you want to be an effective storyteller, and I think Paizo is intelligent in breaking down these 3 different modes of play to help storytellers understand the pacing of their stories and how to balance the different needs in storytelling. Think about it. When we tell stories in any setting, we adjust the pace of the stories to reflect the need of the story. If I was going to tell you the story of the bad car wreck that I had in Indianapolis a few years ago, I would essentially be describing that story in encounter mode, because when I was in that experience, it was as if time slowed down and what was truly just a few seconds in the real world felt like it stretched out for an hour in my mind. By the same token, if I was going to tell you the story of the time that I crossed the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, I would probably be telling that story in exploration mode. That story would progress a little bit faster, but would still have a lot of detail so that I could describe that particularly awe-inspiring moment. Now imagine that somebody asked me the story of how I built this YouTube channel. Well, if I did that story, I would be talking about over a year's worth of work, and I guarantee you that story would play out in downtime mode because I wouldn't need to go minute by minute or day by day in order to relay that information. We adjust our pacing when we tell stories because every story has a different need and a different focus that we're trying to achieve. In fact, if I were to summarize the challenge of pacing a story well, I would describe it as balancing tension versus progress in your story. Tension is the moment in the story where the outcome is the most nebulous, where we don't know what's going to happen, and inches and seconds literally matter. I would correlate this to encounter mode. It's why we slow down for combat in RPGs, because there is so much tension in those moments. On the opposite extreme, you have downtime mode, which is the type of storytelling that has the most progress relative to the other modes of play. A character's accomplishments move faster, and relatively speaking, they get more done, but usually when we're in downtime mode, there's not nearly as much tension to the outcome of what the players are doing. So those are the extremes. Encounter mode is for the moments in play where tension is the highest, and downtime mode is for the moments in play where progress is important, but what about that middle ground? What about exploration mode? Where it's not second by second, but where you don't want to speed up too much because there's a lot of detail that your players might want to know. Well, I think the focus of exploration mode can be described with a single word: discovery. Let's talk about all 3 of these modes and how we can use them narratively. So, the first mode of play is encounter mode. And like I said, encounter mode, we usually associate that with combat encounters. Because when we think about tension in storytelling, combat encounters is definitely one of those moments where tension is the highest. It's the reason that fight scenes in movies often happen in slow motion, because you want to see how every movement plays out. That high degree of tension creates a lot of narrative stake for the people who are experiencing the story. Now, it is important to note that combat encounters are not necessarily the only type of encounter mode you might play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Another easy example would be social encounters, intense negotiations, or spirited debates, moments where your characters are trying to persuade a potential ally or dissuade a potential enemy. Blades do not have to be drawn for tension to be extremely high inside of a story. The point is this: encounter mode slows the story down so you can really focus in on the details of tense narrative moments. The outcome is unknown, and the joy, the thrill of the story is seeing just how those moments play out. So the next several videos in the series are going to be talking about different aspects of encounter mode, but for now, as a storyteller, the main thing I want to encourage you to think about is this: how can you increase the tension in your story? Now, it is important to note here that you want to be careful with how you increase or use tension in your stories. Just this past Sunday, I was thinking about using a particular story beat in my game, but I also knew that that story beat might be stressful for a couple of my players. And so I actually talked to my players in some very general terms and just kind of said, you know, I am thinking about this kind of encounter. How do you feel about that? And they were open to it, but they were also a little bit hesitant about it. So when I ran that particular encounter, I still used that element to heighten the tension, but I adjusted that particular encounter so that it wasn't quite as tense as I really could have made it. That's basically a long-winded way of saying you do want to be careful about turning up the tension too high during an encounter, but as a storyteller, when you are in encounter mode, ask yourself this question: how can I increase the tension of what is happening in this moment? One of my favorite examples from a recent game is my players were fighting several crawling claws. If you've ever seen that particular monster, it's severed undead hands that scurry around the battlefield and try to swipe people and try to grab their throats. And I had so much fun describing the crawling claws running up their legs and running up their arms to try to get at their throats, basically describing them as giant spiders, if you will. And even though my players were actually doing really well in that fight, and they were taking down the crawling claws pretty easily, that description of them moving like spiders, it was freaking my players out, and I was watching them like, as the game was going on. It was so much fun. That simple detail that I added to how the crawling claws were moving helped increase the tension and made that game more fun for me and for my players. The strength of encounter mode is the focus on detail that it allows you to create, and so think about how you can use details in your story to enhance the tension with respect to your players' boundaries, of course, and I guarantee you, you can build some pretty impressive encounters for your game. Now, the middle ground of these modes of play is exploration mode. It's faster than encounter mode, it's slower than downtime mode, and of the three modes of play, sometimes it could be the hardest to pin down. Your characters are moving quick enough that they are probably progressing from point to point and place to place at a reasonable speed, but at the same time, they're not progressing too fast because there's still some tension to the setting. The difference between traveling down a road in downtime and traveling down a road in exploration mode is if your party's in exploration mode, there's a real possibility there's bandits on that road. Now, this nebulous element to exploration mode can make it hard to pin down, but I think if we look at exploration mode through the lens of discovery, that can help us as storytellers make exploration mode more impactful and more meaningful to our players. The story here is not about the journey that your players are taking, but rather about what they discover on that journey. And when you slow a game down to exploration mode, one of the questions you want to ask yourself as a storyteller is, what can my players discover here? And discovery can go a lot of different ways. It can be good discoveries, it can be bad discoveries. Stumbling upon a murder scene and finding a hidden oasis are both discoveries, and yet I would imagine players should be responding to them quite differently. At least hopefully. Once you have a good grasp on what your players can discover during exploration mode, the next thing you want to ask yourself as a storyteller is how you can enhance that sense of discovery. And this is one of those spots where an old writing challenge really comes to the fore, and that is, how can you modify the details of your player's surroundings to make that sense of discovery more intense? What narrative tricks or options do you have to imply that there is something hidden that your players might be able to find? It's a trick so old that it was a meme before we even knew what memes were, but the treasure map with a giant X on it implies that there is something hidden that needs to be found. How can you modify the sights, the sounds, the smells of the environment of the game to imply to your players that there is something more going on than what they might initially be aware of? Describing unusual echoes or mysterious smells are just a couple of simple ways to lead your players to a discovery of something new, interesting, exciting, or maybe even terrifying. If you want to make exploration mode memorable, think of it through the lens of discovery. What can my players find? And how can I describe the scene to help them realize there is something they need to find? Now, our final mode of play is Downtime Mode. And as I've already established, Downtime Mode exists to help your players have a sense of progress. But I feel there's an important caveat that we need to put in here, that Downtime Mode is still a mode of play. There is still some risk of failure for your players. Sure, their lives may not be in danger, but that doesn't mean everything's going to work out a-okay. While they're traveling through an ancient woodland, they may not meet any enemies for a while, but that doesn't mean that they can't get lost. When we look at downtime as a mode of play, we still need to remember that there is usually some element of challenge to what the players are doing. It's just that those challenges can often be resolved a little bit easier or a little bit quicker than encounter mode or exploration mode would normally allow. For example, a character who wants to go shopping to find supplies to build a new magical staff, in that situation, there is a chance they won't find the supplies that they need, but you can probably resolve their success or failure in finding those supplies with 1 or 2 quick rolls. You can progress the story very quickly through what would otherwise be a lot of very slow encounters. And the examples here are numerous. If a character is trying to run a business, Downtime Mode could allow you to describe important seasons in that business, days where the business is doing well, days where the business is struggling, major issues that might come up for your players as they attempt to run that organization. While there is certainly a possibility of failure, your players are able to move towards their goals at a very rapid pace. And I think this is where we really want to pause and imagine the impact that downtime can have on our games. If we want downtime to be meaningful, we need to be sure that our players have that sense of progress, that they are stepping towards a goal or maybe losing progress towards the goal. We want our players to have that sense that they are chasing some kind of goal and either winning or failing. In other words, it's not super exciting to roleplay downtime mode if the only thing that your player is doing is crafting 8,927 iron daggers. Skyrim, I'm looking at you. The meaningful accomplishment is gaining legendary crafting, not the pile of useless weapons that you left behind you. And as a storyteller, you want to make sure that you are focusing on the achievements, the progress, the dreams and goals that your characters have. So those are the 3 different modes of play, and the main story beat that I think that each of those modes of play serves in our Pathfinder 2nd Edition games. Encounter mode is useful when you really want to highlight the tension of your story. Exploration mode is useful when you really want to highlight the concept of discovery in your story. And then downtime mode is most useful when you want to highlight the personal progress that your characters are experiencing. Before I leave this concept though, I do want to point out that these modes of play are not mutually exclusive in the emotional impact that they can have. You can have dramatic reveals during an encounter that would count as a discovery in play. By the same token, the description of a long and exhausting war between two nations could very easily have a lot of tension to it. You can certainly pull different story beats from different modes of play when it is relevant to what you're doing in your game, but as general rules, I think we can look at these three modes of play as the easiest or most straightforward way to include these story beats in our games. Now, obviously, I have just given a bird's eye view of these three modes of play. There is a lot more information that goes into each of these modes, and so for the next bit with this series, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into each mode of play separately and talk about the different mechanical issues, the different story issues that come up when using these modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we're really going to look for ways to enhance these modes of play so that the players in our game will be remembering our stories far down the road. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on the three modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Do you like this division that Paizo has created? And do you agree with my interpretation of the story function that these different modes of play serve inside of the game? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. I appreciate all of the comments that I get, and I appreciate the wonderful community that we're building. If you're interested in being part of the Disaster Tour Guide community, check out my free Discord page, which I have linked in the video description. You can also support this channel financially by checking out my Patreon. I've got a link to that in the video description as well. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.